Chapter 2. It begins. 2 months earlier, Skye was laid back in her padded office chair humming as she munched on her favorite salad. Her right hand clicked her mouse, queuing up a few James Corden and Jimmy Fallon videos. Her favorite lunch consisted of salad and coffee. Today, she treated herself to 2 cookies from the batch of chocolate chip she made last night. Skye liked to keep things simple. Her job presented plenty of complications. Young, troubled patients with emotional parents kept her walking a tightrope most days, and sometimes made her own anxiety issues worse. Lunch was her time. Simple, normal, quiet. A notification of a new email from her friend, Diane, flashed onto the screen. Skye clicked on it. Diane had included a YouTube link along with the text. Check this out. It happened near Colton. Everyone's saying this is a hoax, but it's odd. No, it's more than that. It's something strange. What is wrong with this guy? Before and after the message, there were several grimacing emojis. In spite of that, Skye stopped humming. Her curiosity piqued, she clicked the link and pushed play. It was an amateur video, grainy and shaky. This alone would have been enough for Skye to move on, sure it was a joke, regardless of what Diane thought. But she stayed her hand. Her cousin, Tom, was in the video. Tall though blonde and built like a linebacker, he was hard to miss. In her work as a therapist for abused children, Skye often needed information from the local law enforcement agency. Her first choice was Tom, the local sheriff. One thing she knew, if by the book Tom was in this video, it was no hoax. Skye's gaze narrowed as she studied the dark film. A suspect's black SUV sat on the long strip of grass beside a 4-lane highway with multiple police cars surrounding it. While the closer lanes had no traffic, cars still zipped by in the far 2 lanes. She ate her salad as about 30 seconds went by. Police lights flashed. In the fading light, Skye could see a shadowy man in the driver's seat of the SUV. An orange timestamp flashed at the bottom right of the screen. It was taken yesterday evening. Uniformed officers stood in a circle a few yards from the car. Some on alert, others with hands resting on their belts, looking off into the distance. Tom faced the tail of the SUV and away from the camera. With shoulders squared, he looked ready for anything. Skye's hand tightened on her silver fork. The peace of the afternoon was shattered. What exactly was this strange thing Diane talked about? The police officer closest to the suspect's car shouted, "Hands on the steering wheel, sir." "Show us your hands." There was no movement. Hands on the steering wheel. The suspect quickly raised his arms well over his head. They wavered as he held them there for a moment. He dropped them on the steering wheel with such force they bounced before he grasped it. The sound on the video faded in and out. "Out of car, sir." The man didn't move. He didn't even twitch. "Sir? I need step car now." Tom moved his hand to hover over his holster. Still, the guy didn't respond. The officers nodded to each other. With caution, they took a few steps closer to the vehicle. They came to an instant standstill when the driver's door unlatched. It didn't open all the way. It stayed there, barely a bump along the side of the automobile. Something that should have been scarcely noticeable, yet it was all everyone watched. The opening widened, inch by inch. It was an old man struggling to get out of the car. No, not an old man. Someone disabled or ill. One jean-covered leg moved from the car to the ground. Once that foot was stable, the man carefully transferred the other. A shaky hand grabbed the vehicle's door to hoist himself out. His head down, he paid no attention to the chaos surrounding him. He took a single slow, unsteady step, then another. A hand laid on the SUV windows to maintain balance. His right foot lightly dragged along the ground as he walked. At first glance, he didn't appear sinister. Dressed in jeans, a white t-shirt, and a light blue zippered jacket, he could have been making a run to the local grocery store. However, on closer inspection, something was off, something more than difficulty walking. His stiff, unstable gait moved him toward the back of the SUV. Once, then twice, he lifted his head. The wide angle of the lens didn't show much detail, but he squinted his eyes so tight, it was hard to imagine how he could see. Both times the man gave his head a fierce shake, then lowered his gaze back to the ground. Often the man stopped and gave a strange shudder. After a few of these episodes, he jerked and heavily leaned against the van. His head whipped forward, and his hands moved to his chest. Bloody gobs of spit flew from his mouth and rolled down his chin. The milling crowd of bystanders outside the ring of police cars grew, and chatter erupted. The man squinted up at them as he continued to stumble along the side of his black vehicle. With one hand clenching a taillight, he lurched around the end of the car. A light breeze caught his unzipped jacket and blew the left flap back. Strapped to his waist was a gun. The police backed up in unison as they pulled their weapons. Sharp and loud, they barked out their orders. Halt. Stop. Hands in the air. The suspect did not respond. A scowling officer snapped out instructions. Lay your weapon on the ground. But the man continued to hobble along, one short, shaky step after another as he dragged a leg behind him. The policeman shook his head and conferred with two others. As dusk turned to darkness, they struggled to see. A few officers pulled out flashlights and pointed them toward the SUV. The rays of light played along the exterior of the dark-colored car, searching for the suspect. The sudden display of bright light made the surrounding night appear that much darker. They hunted for the man without success, adding more flashlights to the search. The brilliant beams began to move in a frantic pattern. Out of the darkness, he appeared. The intense beam caught him full in the face. The man, who had acknowledged nothing else, reacted. Hands clenched into fists as he flung his arms up to cover his face. His head swung so hard his whole body moved back and forth with the motion. With a quick movement, he brought his arms back down. Stiff and straight, he held them at his side. The camera zoomed in on the suspect's face. There was an odd blankness to his eyes. His skin was pasty white, drained of all color, except for his lips. A trick of the light, perhaps, because his lips appeared to be blue. From those blue lips, red, foamy saliva dripped from his mouth, over his chin until it rolled off his face, staining his jacket. The suspect stilled for a moment. His face twisted in rage. He bared his red-smeared teeth and lunged toward the nearest flashlight. The officer behind it called out a warning. "Sir, we know you are unwell. You must surrender, or we will shoot." The man stopped and wavered. His eyes rounded in desperation. He spoke for the first time, his voice hesitant, guttural and phlegmy. "I can't. I've tried." Disease ward against man. The winner was clear when he lurched toward the policeman. The officer fired his gun, but showing pity, hit the suspect's lower leg. The man's body jerked, but he kept coming. Pain didn't affect him. When surrounded, he changed direction, to another light, another officer. "Stand down, or we will put you down." A second shot rang out. Blood ran from the suspect's upper arm, dripping to the pavement. His leg wound continued to bleed, drenching his entire lower leg. There was no sign of slowing. Instead, the man's outrage increased. He dripped with sweat. His chest heaved with emotion, his hands became fists. Bloody spit oozed between his clenched teeth. Blue lips pulled back in a tight, unnatural grimace, dripping red wavering ribbons onto his chest. He turned to another light, his face stark in the glare, Tom's flashlight. Despite his injuries, the suspect raced toward Sky's cousin. Tom took 2 small steps backward before stopping and holding his ground. Tom opened his mouth to call out. There was no time. The air shattered with the sound of the shots. Once. Twice. The man dropped to the ground. A serene expression graced his face. As if, at last, he felt peace. Then he was gone. The video flickered and ended. Sky's shaky hands covered her mouth, holding back a scream. Her bracelets lightly clanged together as she lowered her arms and leaned back in her chair. She willed herself to draw in a few slow breaths to calm herself. She would have heard by now if Tom was hurt. She took a sip of the still steaming coffee and lowered the cup too fast. Sky knocked it against her desk and sent small beads of hot latte sloshing onto her hand. She gasped at the sharp burn of the hot liquid. After righting the cup and correctly setting it on the table, she brought her hand back up to her lipsticked mouth. Sky leaned toward the computer screen and narrowed her eyes in thought. She rewound the video and stopped it on the dying man. She stared at the scene. It was impossible. Sky raised her gaze and let it drift across the homey earth tones of the large room. Her latte's taste turned acrid on her tongue as her troubled mind replayed what she'd just seen and rejected it. She couldn't be seeing it right. But sometimes the mind comes across something so unfamiliar, so bizarre it refuses to accept it as reality. Was that happening to her? No, Tom was in the video. It had to be real. Blue lips, the dripping red saliva? Was the limp a symptom too? How can a person be shot that many times and keep going? None of it made sense. Worried about Tom and wanting answers, Sky picked up her cell phone. She punched in his number, but all she heard was ring after ring without a response.